Hey fellas, this is Collin here and watching Faceoff, where I take any two games that are vaguely connected and decide which one is superior. And for this episode, I'll be looking at two Rockstar games about two gunslingers who realize that living as an outlaw in the Wild West isn't what it's cracked up to be. That's right, the games I'll be comparing this time are Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2. And both are such narrative masterpieces that admittedly, I'm going to have to split a few hairs when deciding which Red Dead is truly the superior entry. Nevertheless, I will try my best. Red Dead Redemption's inception began with Rockstar's acquisition of the franchise and Angel Studios from Capcom, after which Rockstar San Diego was given the go-ahead by its parent company to finish what would ultimately become the first game in the franchise, Red Dead Revolver. Red Dead Redemption was released 6 years later as a sort of spiritual sequel that was set in the same universe but ultimately told its own story. That story being about a former outlaw named John Marston who tries to start over in life by starting a ranch before he is tasked and blackmailed by federal agents to kill former members of the gang he used to run with or risk never seeing his family again. Released in 2010, Red Dead Redemption was one of the most expansive and expensive games put on shelves, as Rockstar put their all into creating their love letter for old Western films, while also telling their story amongst the backdrop of a declining Old West. Like I said before, gone were the days when outlaws were basically given carte blanche to disregard any rules or laws to live life the way they please, as now the West was becoming industrialized, gentrified, and urbanized, which is made very clear at the start of the game when we see people of higher status migrating west, and in the third act when we see Blackwater, a fully realized city that obviously contrasts heavily with anyone's idea of what the Old West looked like. Nevertheless, the Old West isn't dead yet, as John Marston hunts down Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and the former leader of the gang himself, Dutch Vanderland, while aiding a Mexican rebellion along the way, of course. I don't mince words when I say that Red Dead Redemption was the AAA Old Western sandbox that anyone could have asked for, and to set the bar for what Old Western games could achieve, a bar only Rockstar would reach about 8 years later. And aside from awkward mechanics regarding riding horses and shooting while on horseback, Red Dead Redemption had exceptional playability. The Western settings also really helped bring the game to life, as did the period appropriate wardrobes and rundown dirt towns that complete any Old Western setting. And even though Rockstar plays it tongue-in-cheek quite a bit in this game, they were also clearly telling a narrative to be taken seriously, almost similar to how GTA 4 took a dramatic turn in comparison to the previous games. But amidst all this drama is an Old West filled with the most insufferable yet colorful characters that test yours and your character's patience every step of the way. When you're not killing your old friends, you're helping the biggest idiots in the West in the hopes that they return the favor, whether it's helping a literal snake oil salesman con a bunch of people, or a self-absorbed Mexican rebel leader trying to seize power. You'll be doing favors for the worst people imaginable in order to gain an edge when hunting down your old buddies. But it's also because of this that it feels that John Marston lacks any real agency, because he'll do any odd job imaginable with little to no convincing despite more important matters being at hand. The only real choice John is given in the game is whether or not he wants to turn his bounties in dead or alive. That's not to say that John Marston isn't one of the most iconic video game protagonists ever, because that would just be ridiculous. Aside from his obvious Clint Eastwood-esque appeal, he's also an extremely easy character to get behind, with goals he chases so earnestly that it only makes the ending that much harder to swallow. John is also more verbose than the usual Clint Eastwood type, as he constantly chews out the people around him, including the federal law enforcement that essentially has his family in hostage, but the most endearing aspect of him is his earnest attempt to settle down and live an honest life after living it in the most dishonest way possible, and his ability to constantly grow and learn despite not knowing much about running a ranch. It's what makes it all the more tragic when he's not only thrown back into the gunslinger lifestyle, but he doesn't get to live to bear the fruit of his efforts after he's gunned down by the very men who force you to hunt down your former friends. Despite some visuals not aging well in the 9.5 years it's been out, the first Red Dead Redemption remains a must-play and a narrative masterpiece that represented a key shift in Rockstar's efforts to create dramatic storytelling. Everything from its Western aesthetic to its standout protagonist add to an experience that few games ever measure up to, again except for that sequel that came out 8 years later. In direct contrast to its predecessor, Red Dead Redemption 2 is probably the most technically impressive game ever coded. Everything from how sunlight dips into the trees, how clothes move in the wind, how realistic the night sky looks, how the vegetation almost looks photorealistic. I could go on, but Red Dead Redemption 2 successfully translates the natural world from how we perceive our physical realm into this game. It's the most realistic piece of media I've ever had the pleasure to experience, but sometimes it can be realistic to the point where it's tedious. Red Dead 2 certainly isn't for those who savor instant gratification. Instead of immediately bursting out into a sprint, your character gathers up natural momentum when attempting to run faster. When you run into anyone or anything while riding a horse, you will fall off. You have to hit one button to open a drawer, the same button to obtain the item inside the drawer, and the same button again to close the drawer. When heading into any fight, you only bring with you the stuff you actually have equipped, while the rest of your items stay on your horse. If you are from a far enough distance, you cannot whistle for your horse, and you'll be forced to travel on foot to your location until you are within an optimal proximity from your horse. Despite how annoying this all is, I'd be lying if it doesn't immerse you into the game a little bit more. And finding your hat when it falls off is an admittedly fun minigame, but Rockstar's adamant shift towards hyperrealism can sometimes be a major detriment to its gameplay. But it being a Red Dead 2 game, the narrative has to succeed above all else, and it does. You remember how you had to hunt down the former members of Dutch's gang in the first game? Well, now you're in Dutch's gang 12 years before the events of the first game, and you're playing as a new protagonist, Arthur Morgan, who is Dutch's right-hand man and an outlaw through and through. Dutch's mission in life is to build a truly free life outside the confines of the United States and the laws that come with it. But the slow decline of the Old West complicates things for Dutch. The civilization that Dutch detests so much is moving west, and federal law agencies are cracking down on gang activity. But nothing shakes Dutch's optimism, as his confidence and exemplary leadership is enough to get his gang out of any bind, until the end, of course. Based off the events of the first game, you know immediately that all goodwill goes out the window at some point, and seeing Dutch's descent into his pathetic madness is engrossing despite the fact that you know it's coming. Putting Dutch's gang front and center in a prequel also serves as a great opportunity to get to know the people he killed in the first game, as well as quite a few more people who used to run with the gang, including Mr. John Marston himself. Dutch's gang is practically a family, and the campsite acts as a hub to interact with each and every one of them. The camps always feel super lively with everyone going about their daily routine and their interactions with each other. It's hard to measure up to John Marston as a protagonist, which was probably one of Rockstar's toughest tasks when making this game, but I think they nailed it with Arthur Morgan. Arthur Morgan has that same rough exterior as John Marston and a quick lip to go with it, but one thing that puts him above John is the fact that his character has agency. For a while, Arthur just does what he's told by Dutch and runs errands to maintain the upkeep of the game. But during the climactic moments of Red Dead 2, Arthur himself makes the choices that pushes the game's narrative. And he has an even bigger character arc than John, as we see him transition from Dutch's right-hand man into an unlikely hero by the end. But unfortunately, just like John Marston, he meets a terrible end, made all the more tragic by his good deeds. Both Red Dead 1 and 2 serve as a definitive old western sandboxes that I'm sure no other studio will measure up to, and both have endearing protagonists and an engrossing narrative to match it, but the playability for both games remains vastly different. While the first Red Dead had streamlined controls and mechanics, the second Red Dead's focus on realism seriously hampers its playability. To put it simply, the first Red Dead is easier and more fun to play. The story of the first game also stays consistent in its quality, while the narrative quality of the second game takes an obvious dip after the shipwreck that leaves the gang stranded on some island. From there, every mission in the game is one shootout after another, and it seems like the game just abandons its methodical approach and variety as it races towards the finish. And for those two reasons, I have to give the win to the first Red Dead Redemption. While the second game has a better protagonist and graphics that puts any game to shame, the first Red Dead has better pacing, writing, and other intangibles that you can't compensate for with coating realistic ear cartilage. It's impossible to compare these two games without splitting any hairs, but the first Red Dead firmly gets the win here. Thanks for watching Faceoff. Feel free to hit the like button down below, subscribe to the channel, and follow us on Twitter at GTV Goofing Off. See ya!